the summer of 1964, the small town of Ashwood, Oregon looked like something straight out of a postcard. Nestled between tall pine forests and a winding two-lane highway, the town had barely 3,000 residents. Everyone knew each other by name, and strangers were noticed the moment they drove down Main Street. On most evenings, people sat on their front porches sipping iced tea while the golden sunlight faded behind the trees. It was the kind of place where crime almost never happened, where doors were rarely locked, and where life moved at a calm, predictable rhythm. Among the familiar faces in Ashwood were Robert and Elaine Carter, a married couple who had lived in town for nearly a decade. Robert was a quiet, hard-working man in his early 40s who spent most of his days at the local lumber mill. The mill sat just outside town, surrounded by stacks of freshly cut timber and the constant scent of pine in the air. Robert rarely spoke much, but when he did, his deep voice carried a calm kindness that people trusted. His coworkers often described him as dependable, the kind of man who showed up early, worked late, and never complained. Elaine Carter, on the other hand, brought a completely different energy to the town. She owned a small antique shop on Main Street, a cozy little store filled with old clocks, vintage jewelry, dusty books, and forgotten treasures from decades past. Locals loved stopping by just to hear her stories about where each item came from. Elaine had a warm smile and a gentle voice that made customers feel welcome the moment they stepped through the door. Sometimes children from the neighborhood would gather near the shop window just to listen to her talk about the strange history behind the objects she sold. The Carters lived in a modest white house at the edge of town, where the paved road slowly turned into a narrow dirt path leading toward the forest. Behind their home stretched miles of thick woodland, a quiet wilderness of towering pine trees and shadowy trails. Robert and Elaine had a routine they rarely broke. Almost every evening after dinner, they would take a slow walk along a narrow path that disappeared into those woods. Neighbors often saw them walking side by side as the sun went down, their silhouettes fading into the trees while the sound of crickets filled the air. To the people of Ashwood, the Carters seemed like the perfect picture of an ordinary, peaceful life. They didn't argue in public, they didn't attract trouble, and they never gave anyone a reason to worry about them. But sometimes, late at night, a few neighbors claimed they noticed something unusual. The Carter house lights would stay on far later than usual, and occasionally, faint shadows could be seen moving behind the curtains long after midnight, as if someone else might have been inside the house. Fearful face evergreen. The morning after Robert and Elaine Carter were last seen, something immediately felt wrong in the quiet neighborhood. A neighbor named Mrs. Dalton, who lived across the dirt road, noticed that the Carter house lights were still on even though the sun had already risen high over the pine trees. Normally, Robert would have left early for the lumber mill, his old pickup truck rumbling down the road before most people in town were awake. But that morning, the truck was still parked in the driveway, completely untouched. By late afternoon, when the antique shop on Main Street still hadn't opened and no one had seen the couple all day, concern quickly began spreading through the small town of Ashwood. Mrs. Dalton eventually walked across the road and knocked on the Carters' front door. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, but the house remained silent. What caught her attention next was the back door, slightly open, gently creaking as the wind pushed it against the frame. Feeling uneasy, she stepped inside and called out their names, her voice echoing softly through the quiet house. The kitchen lights were still on, and on the dining table sat 2 plates of half-eaten dinner, as if the couple had suddenly stood up and left in the middle of their meal. Within an hour, Sheriff Harold Bennett arrived at the house after receiving the call. Bennett was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s who had been the town's sheriff for nearly 20 years. He was known for being calm under pressure and for keeping Ashwood peaceful for decades. As he slowly walked through the Carter home, he noticed several strange details. Robert's wallet rested neatly on the bedroom dresser, and Elaine's purse still hung on the hook near the front door. Nothing appeared stolen, and there were no signs of a struggle anywhere in the house. Outside, deputies carefully examined the ground around the property. The soft dirt near the open back door should have revealed footprints, but strangely, the area looked almost untouched. The only visible path led toward the narrow trail that disappeared into the forest behind the house. Sheriff Bennett organized a search party that same afternoon. Volunteers from town, along with deputies and tracking dogs, spread out through the thick woods, calling the couple's names as they pushed deeper between the tall pine trees. For hours the search teams followed the faint scent picked up by the dogs along the Carters' usual walking trail. The trail twisted through the forest for nearly half a mile before reaching a clearing surrounded by heavy brush and towering trees. Suddenly, the dogs began circling one specific spot of ground, barking and whining as if they had lost the trail completely. The scent didn't continue any farther. It simply stopped there, as though Robert and Elaine Carter had vanished into thin air right in the middle of the woods. Evergreen Eye # fearful face. In the weeks following the disappearance of Robert and Elaine Carter, the quiet town of Ashwood no longer felt the same. At first, the entire community came together to help with the search. Volunteers walked through miles of forest, calling the couple's names and scanning the ground for even the smallest clue. But as days slowly turned into weeks, the search parties grew smaller, and hope began to fade. With no evidence and no clear explanation, the mystery surrounding the Carter disappearance slowly transformed into something darker, something that made people uneasy whenever the subject came up. Soon, strange rumors began spreading through town. Late at night inside the small diner on Main Street, locals whispered about things they had seen or heard near the forest behind the Carter house. One man claimed that just days after the couple vanished, he had been driving along the dirt road and noticed a faint light moving between the trees, deep in the woods where no houses existed. At first he thought it was another search group, but the light seemed to move slowly and then suddenly disappeared as if someone had switched it off. Another resident, an elderly hunter named Calvin Rhodes, told deputies about something unusual he had noticed while walking through the woods during deer season that same year. While moving along a narrow trail not far from where the search dogs had lost the Carter's scent, he came across a patch of earth that looked strangely disturbed. The soil appeared darker and softer than the ground around it, as if it had been recently dug up and covered again. Calvin reported it to the sheriff's office immediately, but when deputies returned the next morning to inspect the spot, the ground looked completely normal. Stories like these continued appearing over the years. A group of teenagers once claimed they heard strange metallic banging sounds coming from somewhere deep in the forest while camping nearby. Others swore they saw shadows moving between the tall trees late at night, long after the town had gone to sleep. None of these stories could ever be proven, but each one added another layer of mystery to the already unsettling case. As time passed, the disappearance of Robert and Elaine Carter slowly faded from official investigations, but it never fully disappeared from the town's memory. New families moved into Ashwood, businesses changed owners, and the antique shop on Main Street eventually closed its doors. Yet whenever people spoke about the woods behind the old Carter house, their voices lowered slightly, as if the forest itself was still holding onto a secret that no one had managed to uncover. Evergreen Eye # fearful face. By the early 1990s, Ashwood had begun to change. What was once a quiet logging town surrounded by untouched wilderness was slowly becoming a place developers had started to notice. The lumber mill where Robert Carter once worked had shut down years earlier, and many younger families had moved away looking for better opportunities. But with the growth of nearby cities, new construction projects were beginning to push closer to the old forests that had remained untouched for decades. In the fall of 1994, a construction company was hired to clear a section of land just outside town to make room for a new highway extension. The planned route would cut directly through part of the dense forest that had always stood behind the old Carter property. For most of the workers, it was just another routine job, cutting trees, removing roots, and leveling the ground so heavy machinery could move through the area. Few of them had any idea that they were working in the same woods where one of Ashwood's oldest unsolved mysteries had taken place 30 years earlier. On a cool October morning, a small crew began clearing a patch of land near an overgrown trail that had long since disappeared beneath thick brush and fallen branches. One worker named Tom Alvarez was operating a shovel near the base of a large pine tree when he suddenly felt the metal blade strike something solid beneath the soil. At first he assumed it was just a large rock or an old piece of rusted equipment left behind from the logging days. But when Tom brushed away some of the dirt, he noticed something strange. Beneath the roots of the tree was the corner of what looked like aged wood, darkened by years of being buried underground. Curious, he called over a few of the other workers, and together they began digging more carefully around the object. As the dirt slowly came away, the shape became clearer. It wasn't a rock or machinery at all. It was the edge of a large wooden crate, buried deep beneath layers of soil and tangled tree roots. The wood looked extremely old, its surface cracked and weathered, but what caught their attention the most were the thick metal nails sealing the lid shut. The crate didn't look like something meant to store tools or supplies. It looked as if someone had deliberately placed it there, and then made sure it would never be opened again. Evergreen fearful face eye hash. As soon as the construction workers realized they had uncovered something unusual, the atmosphere at the site quickly changed. What had started as a normal morning of clearing trees suddenly turned quiet and tense. The men stood around the partially uncovered crate, brushing dirt from the cracked wood and staring at the heavy nails sealing the lid shut. None of them wanted to be the first to open it. Something about the way it had been buried, deep beneath the roots of an old pine tree, made it feel less like forgotten equipment and more like something that had been intentionally hidden. One of the workers finally suggested they stop digging and call the sheriff's department. Within an hour, 2 patrol cars arrived at the site, followed shortly by Sheriff Daniel Mercer, the man who had taken over the department years after Harold Bennett retired. Mercer was in his 40s and had grown up in Ashwood, which meant he had heard the story of the Carter disappearance since he was a kid. The moment he saw the crate sticking out of the ground, something about it immediately reminded him of that old unsolved case. Deputies carefully cleared the remaining dirt around the crate while investigators photographed the entire scene. The wooden box was large, nearly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, and its surface looked badly aged from decades underground. The nails sealing the lid were thick and hammered tightly into place, as if whoever built the crate wanted to make absolutely sure it would never accidentally open. As the deputies prepared to remove the lid, the small crowd of workers and officers instinctively stepped back. With a crowbar wedged beneath the edge, one of the deputies slowly began pulling the nails loose. The sound of metal scraping against old wood echoed through the quiet forest. One by one, the nails came free until the lid finally shifted slightly. When the deputy lifted it open, a wave of stale air escaped from inside the crate, air that had likely been trapped there for decades. Inside the crate were several objects wrapped in dusty cloth and heavy canvas. Investigators carefully removed the top layer and immediately noticed something chilling. Among the items were personal belongings that had clearly been placed there intentionally: a man's wristwatch with a cracked glass face, a pair of thin metal reading glasses, and a delicate antique brooch that some older townspeople later recognized as something Elaine Carter used to wear inside her shop on Main Street. Beneath those belongings, tightly wrapped in the canvas sheets, were the fragile remains of 2 human bodies that had been hidden in silence beneath the forest for 30 years. Fearful face evergreen eye hash. The discovery of the remains immediately turned the quiet construction site into an active crime scene. Yellow tape was stretched between the trees as investigators carefully documented every detail of the crate and the items inside it. Forensic specialists arrived from the county lab, wearing gloves and protective suits as they slowly removed each piece of evidence. Even though decades had passed, the objects inside the crate were surprisingly well preserved because the heavy canvas and tightly sealed wood had protected them from moisture and decay. Among the personal belongings, investigators began cataloging every item one by one. Robert's old wristwatch was carefully placed into an evidence bag, along with the cracked glasses and Elaine's antique brooch. Each object seemed to confirm what many in Ashwood had feared for 30 years, that the remains inside the crate truly belonged to the missing couple. But as the forensic team continued examining the contents, one investigator noticed something small wedged deep inside the folds of the canvas wrapping. It was a compact cassette tape, the kind commonly used in the 1960s for portable recorders. The plastic casing had faded with age, but the tape inside looked mostly intact. No one could immediately explain how or why it had been placed there. The discovery puzzled investigators because recording devices weren't something Robert or Elaine were known to carry. Yet somehow, this tape had ended up buried with them inside the crate. The tape was carefully transported to the sheriff's office, where technicians attempted to restore and play it using specialized equipment. At first, the recording produced nothing but a low hiss and faint static. But after a few seconds, muffled voices slowly became audible. The sound quality was poor, as if the recorder had been hidden inside a pocket or bag during the recording. Investigators leaned closer to the speakers as the voices grew slightly clearer. One voice sounded like Robert Carter, tense and angry, arguing with someone whose words were difficult to understand. Then another voice could be heard, Elaine's voice, trembling and frightened. For several seconds, the recording captured the sound of hurried movement, as if people were struggling or shifting inside a confined space. And then, in a quiet, panicked whisper, Elaine said a single name, a name that would make the entire room fall into stunned silence when investigators realized exactly who she was talking about. Fearful face microphone hash I hash. When the audio experts enhanced the final seconds of the cassette recording, the whispered name became clearer than anyone in the room expected. Elaine's frightened voice repeated it twice, barely louder than a breath. The moment the investigators heard it, several of them exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't the name of a stranger, a drifter, or someone unknown to the town. It was the name of a man who had once been one of the most respected people in Ashwood. The name Elaine whispered on the tape was Harold Bennett, the same sheriff who had led the search for Robert and Elaine Carter back in 1964. For a moment, no one in the room spoke. Sheriff Daniel Mercer slowly replayed the recording again, making sure they hadn't misunderstood what they had heard. But each time the audio reached that moment, the same quiet voice whispered the same name, clear enough to remove any doubt. Investigators immediately began digging through the department's old records stored in the courthouse archives. The files from the Carter disappearance were still there, stacked inside worn cardboard boxes that had not been opened in years. As deputies reviewed the documents, something unsettling started to emerge. Sheriff Bennett had personally organized nearly every search effort, chosen where the teams would look, and controlled what evidence was recorded during the early days of the investigation. Even more disturbing was the timeline that followed the disappearance. Just 2 months after Robert and Elaine vanished, Bennett unexpectedly announced his retirement from the sheriff's office. According to the records, he claimed he wanted to move out of state to live closer to family. Many people in town had thought the decision seemed sudden at the time, but no one had questioned it. After all, Bennett had served the town for nearly 2 decades and had always been seen as a man people could trust. By the time the cassette tape was discovered in 1994, Harold Bennett had already been dead for several years. With no living witnesses and most of the original investigators long gone, the case suddenly felt more complicated than ever. The final seconds of the tape ended with the sound of sudden movement, a loud crash, and what investigators believed was the heavy lid of a crate slamming shut, followed by complete silence that lasted for the remaining length of the recording. Fearful face evergreen eye hash. As the investigation reached its final stage, the truth felt closer than it ever had before, yet somehow still just out of reach. The cassette tape, the buried crate, and the records from 1964 all pointed toward a story that had remained hidden for decades beneath the quiet forest of Ashwood. But without Harold Bennett alive to answer questions, the full explanation of what truly happened that night was something investigators could never completely prove. The woods behind the old Carter property were eventually cleared for the new highway, and the spot where the crate had been buried slowly disappeared beneath concrete and passing traffic. Life in Ashwood moved forward, just as it always had. New families moved in, new businesses opened, and the town continued to grow. Yet for those who remembered the Carter case, the mystery never fully faded. Many locals still believe that somewhere in those final moments on the tape lies a piece of the story no one has managed to understand. A hidden motive, a missing detail, something that could finally explain why Robert and Elaine Carter were taken into the woods and sealed inside that crate all those years ago. But some secrets, it seems, are buried deeper than the ground itself. And even after 30 years, the forest of Ashwood may still be hiding the rest of the truth.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.